Hey everyone. So this is the second part to the two-part video um, that is essentially a tutorial on how to teach you, or you can follow along as I do this monochromatic still life painting. In the first tutorial, I sketched out the composition in pencil and I added a very light wash. So in this video, I will continue to build on the values of this painting. And I'm using my value scale that I completed the other day to kind of help me map out my values and make sure that all my values are represented in my painting. What you don't see in the corner here is that I do have my laptop open with the photo on full screen of the actual black and white photo of the still life, and I'm using that as a reference the entire time. So I'm looking at my painting as much as I'm looking at the photograph of the actual still life and checking that my values are matching up. So you can kind of see here that I'm starting just to add in a very light, sort of mid-light value. And I'm looking at the photo and just kind of gauge like where are the shadows, and I'm building on the shadows. So don't go right into the shadow with your darkest value. Really think of it as a way that you're building up your values slowly, okay? And you're giving each of your forms the time and the layers to really build kind of that illusion of form. So here on my palette, I have three little compartments, and I've just organized it where my left compartment has a lot of water to pigment, so it's my lightest value. It's mostly water. And then in my middle compartment, I have sort of my mid-tones, and then in my furthest, the right compartment, it's really a lot of pigment, meaning my darker values of this Prussian blue that I'm working with. So you can just see here that I'm just building it slowly. And yeah, just try to follow along. Notice that my brush strokes are kind of modeling the actual form of the fruit. So the way that I'm painting, I'm sort of almost like trying to paint and use my brush to make these like curved strokes to almost allude to the curved form of these pieces of fruit, right? So I've got my apple in the back, my lime in the front, and I have a pear that is on the right side that I haven't really added in much value to except for that first translucent wash. Again, checking over my value scale, just making sure where I'm at. I'm sort of still working with the middle values right now. I really haven't even touched the shadows at this point. Okay, so now I am building on my shadows. So I've gotten in all my middle values onto the three pieces of fruit, and now I'm really going in with the shadows because I've like covered the midtone. So this is going to give me a chance to, again, look very carefully at the photograph that I'm working from and look at where I can see the darkest values. So essentially in my black and white photo, I'm looking at where is there black? Like where do I see a really, really dark shadow where one piece of fruit hits another fruit? Like where is that happening? And I'm just trying to emulate that. And I'm, again, looking very closely at the photograph and then using that to reference where I'm laying down my paint. So, you can kind of see that I'm just being really careful to not bring the darkest values up to the top because I don't really see them at the top. They're like in little speckles, but um, yeah, that really the darkest values are right in that corner edge where the apple is behind the lime and the pear. So I'm really trying to capture that. So please take your time to, take a moment to stop, to really look carefully at the photo that you're working from, and just study where you see those highlights and where you see those shadows. You can do what I just did, which is if you put down too much pigment and you realize, uh-oh, it's not necessarily that dark over there, you can, while the paint is still wet, you can use some paper towel or even a rag to very gently damp, just like dab the paper when it's still damp, and it will remove some of the pigment. I've decided to go ahead and try to add some of the sort of characteristic spots that are on the pear. I really don't know how this is going to turn out, but I'm going for it anyway. And I'm just trying to control my brush and make little marks that I'm looking at the photograph to try to sort of copy. And if it looks a little silly, I might have to go over it with a wash, but I'm just attempting to add a little more character to this pear. As you can see, and I'm turning my paper around because that's giving me a better angle to make these little marks. Um, and I'm using water now to kind of make those marks a little less obvious because if they look too obvious, then it will start to look flat. So I did use some water to smooth that out, and now I'm doing the same thing to the apple. I'm looking at the photograph and looking to see where there are little characteristic stripes or dots or anything that I can possibly add in and give some character to each piece of fruit. Hopefully from watching this video, you are just really seeing the process of adding layer upon layer and that it really isn't something you do very fast. especially if you really want it to have the depth that the photograph has, that you're trying to emulate some of that. It's a very slow process. It takes patience. It takes just going back and forth over each of your objects and seeing how you can add more depth. You keep returning to the photograph to check it over and comparing your values. Yeah, and hopefully you enjoy this process. It is a very, I don't know, it demands patience, but it is very enjoyable to begin to see how convincing your forms begin to look in terms of truly looking like forms rather than shapes, so that they begin to take on a real dimensional quality. I've decided to add in a really light wash in the back because I kind of don't want to leave it just plain white. So I'm just going in and just adding very, very light, a very light wash just to give it a bit of atmosphere, but not doing much at all because in the photograph it is actually white. My painting is pretty close to done at this point, and all I'm doing now is just making sure that I've got my shadows in there correctly, and so I'm just adding in those darkest values where I see them and smoothing it out. So I'm just trying to take my time and make sure that those shadows are looking correct. Okay, I think that this is basically my finishing touch that I'm adding here, and it's pretty much done. So I'm quite happy with how it turned out, and hopefully you enjoy making your own monochromatic still life.